Today we are going to discuss about the assessment methods of introduced species. So this lecture will guide you, will teach you about the assessment methods of introduced medicinal plant species. It is important to know what are the methods that the exotic species, not native species, they introduce to your area, and what are the methods to determine their presence and distributions. Here you see the introduced medicinal plant species are also known as exotic or native plant species, are the species of plants that have been intentionally or accidentally introduced to the ecosystem outside of their origin. So first sentence tell us about the definition of the exotic or not native species. Not native species are those species which are outside your regions. So when they are introduced accidentally or intentionally for some purpose, these species may be introduced for a variety of the reasons. What are the reasons behind to introducing a species outside to the native regions, such as agricultural or horticultural purposes, or through transport of the seed of the plant materials by the human being. So these are the reasons why the species are introduced to any part of the world. First, might they introduce either for agricultural purposes, if some varieties of the wheat, some varieties of the rice, they have a larger productions in China, in America, and they can be introduced in Central Asia due to their production. So this is the agricultural purposes. Sometimes horticultural purposes, sometimes the species they have ornamental values, they have other commercial values, and they are native to other part of the world, but when they are introduced for horticultural purposes to our regions or any part of the country, this is another reason. And the other one is the transport of the seeds. Sometimes the seeds are transported from one country to the other country, from one region to the other regions, and at the same time some plant materials are transported via material exchange by the human beings or the scientists. So these are the reasons for the introduced plant species. Here you see, this is the example of introduced plant species in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and other part of the Central Asia. This is a Xanthoxylum bungenum. Xanthoxylum is native to the temperate regions. It is also found in the Europe. It is also found in the South Asia, but it is introduced to the Central Asia. So this is the example of introduced species, that is a Xanthoxylum. Xanthoxylum is a very important medicinal application because it is sometimes native to the China, that is Chengdu province, that is a Sichuan province, where the Sichuan pepper, it is a common name is Sichuan pepper. It is one of the important commercial product that is commonly used for the cooking items because it is a spice that is used commonly in the Sichuan province, but it is introduced to the Central Asia like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. While certain medicinal plant species that are introduced may have minimal impact on the ecosystem other than have a significant negative impact. So it is important to know what are the impact of exotic species in your ecosystem. Some species have a very lesser impact, but other species have a greatest impact on your native flora and ecosystem. Invasive plant species, for example, are introduced plant species that have the ability to rapidly spread and affect the native plant communities, dangerous to ecosystem, and it is harmful to the ecosystem services as well. Invasive plant species are also cause significant economic damages or the losses, such as the cost of controlling their spread, the loss of revenue from the reduced productivity in the agricultural or forested land. So in some cases we found that the invasive species have a damaging effect or harmful effect to the natural ecosystem or a native ecosystem. For example, Parthenium styroforas that is introduced from America, then China to Central Asia and South Asia have a negative impact on our native agricultural crops. So the invasive species may cause damages to the native ecosystem. They reduce the productivity of the native species as well. What are the important steps? It is important to monitor and manage the introduced plant species to minimize their negative impact on ecosystem. What we do, basically we will monitor about the management of introduced medicinal plant species in order to reduce the losses, in order to reduce the harmful impact on native ecosystem. This can include strategies such as early detections, rapid response, control, removal of the invasive species, and restoration of the native plant species. So what we do, we must adopt these strategies such as to detect the invasive species, to control the rapid spread of this species, and then restoration of the indigenous species or the native species. So these are the important steps to control the invasive species. What are the assessment methods introduced in medicinal plant species? So these are the few methods. I will explain these methods, how to assess, how to study, how to determine the invasive species. Assessing the impact of introduced medicinal plant species on ecosystem can be a complex task. This is not a very simple method. It's a complex task, and there are several methods that the scientists use to evaluate the impact of the invasive plant species. Some of the most common assessment methods for introduced medicinal plant species includes, so these are the following methodologies or the methods to study to determine the impact of the invasive species. The first method is the mapping and monitoring. The scientists, the botanists, the ecologists, the taxonomists conduct the surveys to map the distribution and abundance of the introduced plant species in an ecosystem. The first methods that apply to study the invasive species or the introduced medicinal plant species is the mapping, the distribution, how we can distribute the invasiveness of the species on an ecosystem. This information can help to assess the extent of the species, that is the identify the areas and to study their highest impact in on natural or native ecosystem. So the first method is mapping and monitoring. Here you see in this slide, this is a complete slide for study of the mapping. First we identify the area, then identify the species, then check their abundance, how they are abundant as compared to the native species. This is called as vegetation mapping, reproductive mapping, and the species mapping. So this slide tell us about the mapping and monitoring of the introduced or the invasive species in any area of the world. So here you see these are the computer-based generated graphs or the maps that are basically based on the observations in the field. So these maps tell us about the distribution, areas, abundance of invasive plant species. So here you see in these slides, these are basically the mapping system for introduced plant species. So mapping and monitoring of the introduced plant species. So these are basically to highlight those areas where the native species are affected by the invasive species. So the red colors represent that they have a highest impact, by the yellowish color determined, or the yellowish color showed that they have a lesser impact. So these are basically graphs or the maps that is generated through the mapping and monitoring of the invasive species. Number two. Number two is the ecological impact assessment. This is called as EIA. So this is very important when some industries they are develop in any area for oil exploration, for road construction, for any area. So the EIA is very important before to start industrialization, before to start any project in any area. Ecological impact assessment is very important. So the ecological impact assessment for invasive species is very important, that examine the changes that the introduced plant species may cause in an ecosystem, such as alteration in the soil chemistry, nutrient recycling, and the physical structure of the habitat. So EIA tell us about the impact of the invasive species on ecosystem in the form of soil chemistry, nutrient cycling, physical structure of the habitat. So the second method for assessment of invasive species is the ecological impact assessment. Here you see in this diagram, this is basically ecological impact assessment studies. So in this, there are the steps: describe the recycling of the environment. Number two, uh, awareness are the potential impacts and the proposed mitigations for the potential impact, and describe the impact, overall impact of the invasive species on an ecosystem, either in the form of soil changes, soil formation, soil chemistry, cycling, and all these are sum up in the form of ecological impact assessment. So